The evening was lively, the modern suburban home bustling with the chatter of friends and family. Alex, 36, moved among the guests with a polite smile that masked his inner turmoil. He was a man of quiet strength, sharp, observant, and strategic. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, and his casual attire exuded effortless charm. But beneath his composed exterior, his mind was racing. The party wasn't his idea. Julia, his wife of 12 years, had insisted. The guest list included Marcus, a colleague, she claimed. Alex had long harbored a quiet suspicion about Marcus. He was too polished, too self-assured, and too comfortable in Alex's home. Tonight, Alex intended to confirm what his gut had been warning him for weeks. "Alice, darling," Julia said, gliding over in a wine-red dress that shimmered under the warm lights. Her petite frame and sleek blonde hair made her the focus of many admiring glances. She clutched Marcus's arm as she introduced him to a small group nearby. "Have you met Marcus? He's been such a help at the office." "Yes, we've met," Alex replied, his voice steady, his eyes locking briefly with Marcus's. The man's grin faltered slightly before he extended a hand. "Good to see you again," Marcus said. His polished confidence had an edge to it, a subtle arrogance that Alex found infuriating. As the night unfolded, Alex played the role of the attentive host. His keen eye, however, never strayed far from Julia and Marcus. Subtle glances exchanged between them, a brush of fingers as they passed a drink. It was all too deliberate. Alex felt a dull ache in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. Tonight wasn't about emotions. It was about the truth. Around 9 p.m., Alex noticed Julia and Marcus slipping away. His heart pounded, but he acted calmly, following them discreetly. The hallway was dim, the murmurs of the party fading as Alex approached the den. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack he saw them. Marcus leaned close to Julia, whispering something that made her smile. A smile Alex hadn't seen in months. It wasn't the smile she reserved for him. Debbie, Harvest? Love to lose wasn't going to happen tonight. Alex pulled out his phone, the device trembling slightly in his hand. With deliberate care, he recorded the interaction, capturing the evidence he needed. The moment was surreal, like watching someone else's life unravel. When they rejoined the party, Alex was already there, his demeanor unchanged. Julia approached him, her expression carefully neutral. "I was just showing Marcus the new wine cabinet," she said, casually. "Of course," Alex replied, a slight curve to his lips that didn't reach his eyes. The night continued, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, unaware of the storm brewing. Alex sipped his drink, biding his time. His plan was set, and soon, the lies that had festered in the shadows would come to light in the most public way possible. Alex had always been a man of rationality, someone who approached every problem with strategy rather than impulse. But tonight, as he slipped upstairs after Julia and Marcus, his hands clenched involuntarily. The weight of what he might find tightened around his chest like a vice. He couldn't afford to let anger cloud his judgment, not yet. The upstairs hallway was quiet, the faint hum of the party below muffled by distance and walls. He walked softly, his footsteps absorbed by the thick carpet. At the far end of the corridor, a faint light glowed from the half-open door to the guest bedroom. He paused, pulling his phone from his pocket, and hit the record button before moving closer. Inside, Marcus stood too close to Julia, his voice low and intimate. "We don't have much time," he murmured, his hand grazing her arm. Julia's laugh was soft but tinged with nervousness. "Relax, Marcus. He won't suspect anything. Alex isn't observant." The words stung more than Alex had expected, but they also fueled his resolve. He crouched slightly, angling his phone to capture both their faces without being seen. The soft glow of the lamp bathed their figures in warm light, creating a picture-perfect image of betrayal. "You're sure he won't come up here?" Marcus asked, glancing toward the door. "Trust me," Julia replied, her voice laced with confidence. "He's busy entertaining. Alex is predictable, and tonight he's no different." Alex's jaw tightened. His grip on the phone was firm, his every muscle taut with control. Predictable, she had said. Perhaps she believed that, but she didn't know the extent of his determination. He waited until Marcus leaned in closer, his hand brushing Julia's cheek before ending the recording. He had what he needed. Quietly, he stepped back into the shadows and returned downstairs. Back at the party, Alex's composure was so perfect that no one, not even Julia, noticed a shift in his demeanor. He poured himself a glass of water, watching as guests mingled, unaware of the storm gathering in their midst. Over the next hour, Alex played the long game. He observed Julia and Marcus as they returned to the party. noting how she avoided his gaze while Marcus tried too hard to appear casual. When Julia laughed at one of Marcus's jokes, her hand brushing his arm in a familiar gesture, Alex felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He didn't confront them immediately. Instead, Alex circulated the room, engaging guests in light conversation and ensuring that the party maintained its lively atmosphere. He wanted an audience when the truth came out, and an audience that would ensure Julia and Marcus couldn't spin their way out of the narrative. Midway through the evening, Alex pulled aside one of his closest friends, Eric, who was sipping a bourbon by the fireplace. Eric was perceptive and dependable, someone Alex could trust to corroborate the events that would soon unfold. "Something's off tonight," Alex said, his voice low enough that only Eric could hear. "Keep an eye on Julia and Marcus." Eric frowned but didn't press for details. He nodded, his gaze sharpening as he scanned the room. "You need anything, you let me know," he said simply. The clock struck 10:30, and Alex knew it was time to set his plan in motion. He excused himself to the study, where he connected his phone to the Bluetooth speakers installed throughout the house. After ensuring everything was synced, he returned to the living room. Julia was in the center of the room, laughing with a group of guests, her charm as radiant as ever. Marcus hovered nearby, his presence subtle but deliberate. Alex stepped into the circle, raising his glass. "Everyone," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw attention. The room quieted as heads turned toward him. "I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for coming tonight. Julia and I are so grateful to have such wonderful friends and family." Julia's smile faltered just for a second, but it was enough for Alex to notice. He turned toward her, his expression calm but unreadable. "And speaking of gratitude, I think it's important to celebrate honesty and trust in our relationships." The room buzzed with murmurs, the guests exchanging curious glances. Alex reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for all to see. "I'd like to share something very special with everyone. Julia, Marcus, this one's for you." Before either of them could react, Alex pressed play. The recording echoed through the house, every word and gesture captured with crystal clarity. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Julia's voice filled the room, her casual dismissal of Alex's attentiveness and Marcus's blatant advances laid bare. The betrayal unfolded like a scene from a movie, each second dragging Julia and Marcus deeper into humiliation. Marcus paled, his confident veneer shattered, while Julia froze, her wide eyes darting between Alex and the guests. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of a glass shattering as someone dropped their drink. Alex's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "This is the truth," he said simply, "and now everyone knows it." For a moment after the recording ended, silence gripped the room. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, punctuated only by the faint crackle of the speakers. Alex scanned the faces of his guests. Wide eyes, open mouths, and hands frozen mid-gesture. No one moved. Then came the murmurs, spreading like wildfire. Friends whispered to each other. Family members exchanged uneasy glances. And Julia's cheeks turned ashen beneath her expertly applied makeup. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in stature, his tall frame sagging as if the weight of the room's judgment had landed squarely on his shoulders. Alex stood at the center, the epicenter of this storm. His expression remained calm, his posture steady. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The truth had been laid bare for all to see, and there was no undoing it. Julia was the first to move, breaking the spell of paralysis that held the room. She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Alex, I can explain." "Explain?" Alex's voice was low but sharp, cutting through the murmurs. "Explain what, Julia? How you invited Marcus into our home, our marriage, and thought I wouldn't notice? Or maybe how you smiled at me tonight, all while sneaking off with him behind my back?" Julia's lower lip quivered. She reached out a hand toward Alex, but he stepped back, his movements measured. "Don't," he said. "Don't touch me." Marcus cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself. "Look, okay, Alex, maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private," he said, his voice uneven. "Private?" Alex turned to face him, a bitter smile curling his lips. "You didn't care about privacy when you were sneaking around with my wife. Why should I care about it now?" The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers, a chorus of disbelief and judgment. Alex could feel the weight of the guests' gazes shifting between him, Julia, and Marcus. He had chosen this moment carefully, knowing the public nature of the confrontation would leave no room for denial or deflection. One of Julia's friends, a woman named Claire, stepped forward. "Julia," she said softly, her tone a mix of pity and disapproval, "how could you do this to Alex? To all of us. We trusted you, Julia stammered, her confident facade cracking. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Then how was it supposed to be? Alex asked, his voice rising slightly, though still steady. Tell me, Julia, how did you imagine this ending? Did you think I'd never find out? Or that I'd just forgive and forget? I don't know. Julia's voice broke and tears streamed down her cheeks. It wasn't about you, Alex. It was never about you. I felt empty, okay? Like something was missing. And Marcus filled that void, Alex interjected, his tone icy. How poetic. Marcus, who had been standing stiffly, suddenly found his voice. Look, man, he began, raising his hands in a placating gesture. This wasn't planned. It just happened. It just happened? Alex repeated, his brow arching. That's your excuse? That's what you're going with? He stepped closer to Marcus, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You don't stumble into someone's marriage by accident, Marcus. You made a choice. Both of you did. The room grew tense as Alex's words hung in the air. Marcus glanced around, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the collective judgment. A few guests were already whispering loudly, their words carrying across the room. I can't believe they thought they'd get away with it. They were so obvious tonight. How did we not notice? No, this is unbelievable. Juliet turned to Alex, desperation in her eyes. Please, Alex, she said, her voice hoarse. We can fix this. We can work through it. Alex's laugh was bitter and humorless. Fix this? Work through it? Julia, this isn't a broken vase. This is our marriage, and you smashed it into pieces without a second thought. Eric, Alex's trusted friend, stepped forward, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder. Maybe we should take a breather, he suggested, his voice calm but firm. Alex nodded, exhaling slowly. You're right, he said. Then he turned to Julia and Marcus. But not before I make one thing clear. He faced the room, addressing everyone. This marriage is over, he said, his voice steady. Julia made her choices, and now she'll live with them. As for Marcus, I suggest you leave before someone escorts you out. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Marcus hesitated for a moment before muttering, Fine, and walking toward the door. Julia, sobbing openly now, reached for Alex once more. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. Alex met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Not as sorry as you'll be tomorrow, he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of her decisions. As Alex disappeared into the kitchen, the party began to dissolve. Guests whispered and murmured as they gathered their coats and left, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Julia, still sobbing, sank into a chair, her head in her hands. Alex leaned against the counter in the kitchen, the adrenaline finally draining from his body. Eric joined him, handing him a glass of water. You did the right thing, Eric said. Alex nodded, staring into the glass. Maybe, he replied, but it doesn't make it any easier. The morning after the party dawned gray and somber, a fitting backdrop for the wreckage left in Alex's wake. He sat alone at the breakfast table, his fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Every corner of the room seemed to echo with the events of the previous night. Julia had left shortly after the confrontation, her face tear-streaked and pale. She didn't say where she was going, and Alex hadn't asked. He didn't care. All he knew was that he needed space to think, to feel, and to begin picking up the pieces of his shattered life. His phone buzzed on the table. It had been vibrating non-stop since last night, the notifications piling up. Messages from friends, family, and even some of the guests he barely knew. Some were supportive, expressing their disbelief and outrage at Julia and Marcus. Others were more cautious, urging him to take his time before making any permanent decisions. Alex ignored them all. Instead, he opened his laptop and began combing through the evidence he'd gathered over the past few weeks. The recordings, the text messages, the photos. They all painted a vivid, damning picture of Julia and Marcus's betrayal. He wasn't reviewing them for clarity. He didn't need to. He knew the truth. But he needed to ensure that every piece of evidence was in order for the next steps he had to take. Around midday, the doorbell rang. Alex hesitated for a moment before rising to answer it. He half expected to find Julia on the other side, but instead, it was his younger sister, Emily. She stepped in without waiting for an invitation, her expression a mix of concern and anger. Alex, she said, pulling him into a tight hug. I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? He shrugged, stepping back and gesturing for her to sit. Define okay, he said, his voice devoid of humor. Emily didn't smile. She looked at him carefully, her sharp eyes taking in the lines of tension on his face. I don't even know what to say, she admitted. I mean, Julia, Marcus, I still can't believe it. Alex sighed, leaning back in his chair. Believe it, he said flatly. They sat in silence for a few moments before Emily spoke again. So what now? She asked. What's your plan? Oh, Alex rubbed his temples, the beginnings of a headache pulsing behind his eyes. Divorce, he said simply. I've already contacted a lawyer. Julia made her bed. Now she'll lie in it. Emily nodded, her expression fierce. Good. She doesn't deserve a second chance after what she did to you. Alex didn't respond. Instead, he stared out the window, his thoughts a tangled mess. He'd been with Julia for over a decade. She wasn't just his wife, she was his partner, his confidant, the person he'd trusted most in the world. And she'd thrown it all away. Alex, Emily said gently, breaking into his thoughts, you're going to get through this. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you will. He turned to her, offering a faint smile. Thanks, Em. I appreciate that. As the afternoon wore on, Alex began to take the first steps toward reclaiming his life. He drafted an email to his lawyer, outlining the details of his marriage and the evidence he'd collected. He started making a list of shared accounts and assets, knowing that the process of disentangling their lives would be long and painful. By early evening, his resolve had solidified. He wasn't just going to survive this, he was going to rise above it. Julia and Marcus's betrayal had taken so much from him, but it wouldn't take his dignity or his future. That night, Alex went for a long walk through the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The cold air bit at his skin, but it felt refreshing, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the party the night before. As he walked, he thought about the life he wanted to build moving forward, a life free of lies and deceit. When he returned home, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Eric. Hey man, Eric said when Alex answered. Just wanted to check in. How are you holding up? Alex hesitated for a moment before replying. I'm managing, he said. Well, if you need anything at all, you know I've got your back, Eric said. Thanks, Eric. That means a lot, Alex replied, his voice steady. After the call ended, Alex sat down at his desk and opened his laptop once more. He stared at the blank screen, his mind racing. Then, almost on impulse, he began typing. It wasn't a plan or a strategy, just his thoughts, raw and unfiltered. By the time he stopped, the page was filled with words. It wasn't polished, but it was honest, a reflection of his pain, his anger, and his determination to move forward. He saved the document, closed his laptop, and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. A week had passed since the party, and life for Alex had begun to find a semblance of normalcy, or so it seemed on the surface. Beneath the routine, his emotions churned in unpredictable waves, alternating between relief, anger, and a strange sense of freedom. Though the betrayal still stung, the clarity it brought had allowed him to move forward. The divorce papers were drafted, and Alex had sent them to Julia through his lawyer. He hadn't spoken to her since that night, and he didn't plan to. Her desperate attempts to reach him, calls, texts, even emails, had gone unanswered. He wasn't ready to hear her excuses or explanations. Her actions had spoken louder than any apology ever could. Sitting at the breakfast table one sunny morning, Alex reviewed his lawyer's notes, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. The legal process was moving faster than he'd expected thanks to the overwhelming evidence of Julia's infidelity. The lawyer had assured him that their prenuptial agreement would protect most of his assets, and while the dissolution of a marriage was never easy, it would be straightforward. The doorbell rang, pulling Alex from his thoughts. He hesitated for a moment before answering, bracing himself for another unwelcome encounter. To his surprise, it wasn't Julia standing on the porch, but Claire, one of their mutual friends and a guest at the ill-fated party. Claire, Alex said, stepping aside to let her in. This is unexpected. She smiled faintly, clutching a small basket of baked goods. I figure you could use a pick-me-up, she said, setting the basket on the kitchen counter. I wanted to check on you after, well, you know. Alex chuckled dryly. I appreciate it, but as you can see, I'm still standing. Claire nodded, her expression softening. You know, Alex, everyone's been talking about what happened. I won't lie, it was shocking. But more than anything, people admire how you handled it. The way you exposed the truth without losing your composure? That took strength. Alex shrugged, pouring her a cup of coffee. Strength or survival instinct, he said. I wasn't going to let her turn me into the fool. They sat together for a while, talking about lighter subjects. The weather, a mutual friend's recent engagement, and Claire's work. It was a refreshing reprieve from the emotional turmoil of the past week. As the conversation wound down, Claire hesitated, her gaze steady. You know, Alex, it's okay to let yourself feel everything. You don't have to be strong all the time. Her words stayed with him long after she left. That evening, Alex allowed himself to sit with his feelings. He went through old photos of happier times with Julia, not out of regret, but to acknowledge the good memories alongside the bad. The process was painful, but it brought him a strange sense of closure. The next day, Alex returned to work for the first time since the party. His colleagues were respectful, avoiding any mention of the scandal. It was a welcome distraction, allowing him to immerse himself in projects that required his full attention. As the hours ticked by, Alex realized how much he had missed the steady rhythm of his professional life. By Friday, Alex decided to meet Eric for drinks at their favorite pub. The atmosphere was warm and familiar, and for the first time in weeks, Alex felt like himself again. They laughed over old stories, the tension of recent events momentarily forgotten. You know, Eric said, raising his glass, this is just the beginning for you. You've got a clean slate now, a chance to build something new. Alex smiled, clinking his glass against Eric's. Here's to new beginnings, he said. That night, as Alex sat alone in his living room, he reflected on Eric's words. A clean slate. The thought was both daunting and liberating. He could rebuild his life on his terms, without compromise or deception. He picked up his phone, scrolling through a list of contacts. His thumb hovered over a number. An old friend from college who had always been a source of wisdom and encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Alex dialed. Rachel, he said when she answered. It's Alex. I know it's been a while, but I was wondering if you'd like to grab coffee sometime. The conversation flowed easily, and by the end of the call, they had made plans to meet the following week. For the first time in a long time, Alex felt a spark of excitement, a hint of possibility. As he prepared for bed, Alex glanced at his reflection in the mirror. He looked tired but determined. The scars of betrayal were still fresh, but they no longer defined him. He was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. The past was a lesson, not a life sentence. And as Alex turned out the lights and climbed into bed, he knew one thing for certain. His story was far from over.